Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. In recognition of International Women's Day 2025 on Saturday the March the 8th, Bridge and I are diving into the stories of inspiring women throughout history. Women whose leadership, vision and resilience have left a lasting impact. We'll explore what made them catalysts for lasting change, the skills they brought to the table, the challenges they faced, and most importantly, whether their leadership approaches still hold relevance in today's world, even if they lived centuries ago. And while we're focusing on women in history, this conversation isn't just about the past. It's about what we can all learn from their approaches today. Phew! Let's see where this takes us. I cannot wait to find out who Bridge has chosen. So let's get started in being a catalyst for lasting change. Hello, woman of history.
Hello. I'm not that old.
We could talk about you.
We're not that old.
And being a catalyst of lasting change. I'd like to think that we might be somewhere in there, but not really.
Yes, More Than a Lumpy Jumper will be one day the topic of another podcast.
Can you imagine that? Blimey.
That'd be lovely.
That would be very lovely. And I love the fact that we've gone down this route because after last year's little initial hiccup when we decided to do this as a topic and found that we'd been, or I, rather than we, had been on a different website to you to come up with the different key theme being held for International Women's Day, that I said this might be safer if we did this. So I think this is actually really cool and I've really enjoyed deciding who I was going to bring to the party.
Yeah.
So fingers crossed, we've got 3 each, so that'll be 6.
I know, I was thinking that yesterday. I was going, oh my God, I wonder if we're going to end up with this thing.
That would be hilarious.
Maybe we should have spoken to each other about
this. Never mind getting the bloody theme not the same thing. This could be 6 or it could be 3. Or somewhere in between. All will be fine, and there'll be something in it. So not too bad, I think. So, who's going to go first?
I'm going to go with the first one because, this is, as you said, this has been super fun. Sort of going through and thinking, oh God, who am I going to narrow it down to in the 3? And then I kind of went off on a little tangent in my head, and quite a lot of the ones I came up with were mythological rather than real. So then I was like, no, actually, I better focus on real women because there actually are already so many great examples. But this one is really close to me because this woman played a huge role in, I guess, who I am today, because she's a woman called Cornelia Connolly, and she was the founder of the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, which is effectively the band, I'm going to call them band, of nuns who taught me. And because of her background, they were effectively feminist nuns, well, as far as I could sort of perceive anyway. It was their sort of mentality that impacted me to say, I was never told there was anything a woman couldn't do until I got to university, really. I was quite surprised when people started saying to me, what do you mean you're going to do that? Because girls don't do that sort of thing. And while generally nuns are not always viewed as a feminist group, but actually I think often the more you look at it, they probably are, because they got their power, particularly historically, in times where women didn't really have very much power. But anyway, Cornelia Connolly, fascinating woman. And just to sort of narrow it all down, she was married to a guy who was an Episcopal priest. They had a couple of children. He decided he wanted to convert to Catholicism, and he then decided he wanted to be ordained, went to Rome, got permission to become a priest, but it meant that she effectively had to make a vow of celibacy and be separated from her husband. Her children were put into boarding school, and she became a nun. And her joys of she then set up schools for women, and particularly in the UK. So she became a leader in ensuring education for women. And because her husband then decided he didn't want to be a priest anymore, and he ultimately sued her in the UK courts for restitution of his conjugal rights because she wanted to stay a nun, and he won. But then, because of the scandal and how it didn't look great that there was a man trying to force a nun to have sex with him effectively. Nobody would fund his appeals, so it didn't go any further. So she continued to teach, gather nuns together, set up schools and teach young women. And because of that sort of that background, there is this sort of feminist element to the way the nuns have taught, which is that we were always taught that we should be independent, that we should be, whatever our skills were, we were encouraged to really focus on our skills rather than sort of worry about preparing to just be wives. So not that there's anything wrong with being a wife, but we were encouraged that we should have some form of independence so that we could be wives if we wanted to be wives, I think is maybe a nicer way of putting it. And so, yeah, she was a trailblazer, a leader. She withstood all kinds of pressures to conform and didn't. So, yeah, she's my first one.
Well, and I'd safely say that as a catalyst for lasting change, you are a bona fide result of her teaching. I think we can safely say that's awesome. So I was going to try and make a joke by going, oh God, I picked her too, which of course would not have worked at all, because clearly that would be, Cornelia, you sound amazing, but certainly not somebody that I've come across before now. But I think what's quite hilarious, and I am going to go with this one first, is that you could probably put this person that I'm just about to say, the utter juxtaposition of where you might have Cornelia Connolly, because I picked Cleopatra. So why did I pick Cleopatra? So here is a leader that I think has been entirely misconstrued across history, where it makes so much sense for those who came across her to be very biased about that she got all of her own way and all the rest of it because she was beautiful and using her feminine wiles. And what gets left out is her intelligence, her political savvy, as well as her charm. So when I started looking into Cleopatra, for example, she knew 9 languages. She knew how to speak 9 languages. And I often purport as a leader that we would do well to be language learners. And I don't just mean in terms of, oh, can you speak French, German, blah, blah, blah. I'm meaning actually understanding the language within a business. And so I think that her being able to make connection and relationship with people was often because she had linguistic skills. And yeah, we know that there was relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but they were equally that if a bloke had been doing it, it would have been political savvy and strategically aligning themselves. Well, that's exactly what she was doing. Throughout history, we've seen those marriages that worked because of what people were trying to decide upon from a strategy for a country or whatever it might be. So I was an element of, why can't it be the other way around? So that was one of the other questions I had. The other sort of like slight anecdotal bit, that I don't think that there is anything, I don't know quite what you're going to make of this, but I don't think that there's anything wrong necessarily from if you have feminine wiles and they are working in order to actually influence, why wouldn't you use them? And I know categorically that whilst I was in the military in particular, some bosses would say to me, all right then Bobby, we're going to send you in because you're more likely to get a yes to a Hercules or a helicopter. And guess what? I did get a yes to a helicopter and a Hercules. And who knows whether if a bloke had gone in to actually do that or not, whether the answer would still be the same. We will just have to sort of like leave that to the annals of history. But the fact remains is that, we are who we are from females in leadership, and there are other things at disposal. So I don't see that Cleopatra should be bashed for that in any way, but it was just an integral part of who she was. Equally, when you read up on her, she ran a whole economy. Everything that she had in Egypt, she owned. That was something that she'd created. She was powerful from that sort of like economic sense as well. And so I was listening to a YouTube by a lady who has written a book about her life, Stacey Schiff, and she was talking about often women in history are captured by 3 different narratives: delusional, disability, or death. So she was sort of like making examples of the delusional element was Joan of Arc, disability, Helen Keller, and then death, Amelia Earhart, and Cleopatra, because she was so resilient about how she had faced betrayal and defeat, etc., that actually choosing to end her life on her own terms rather than, others being victorious over her was a strong choice. So I think that whilst if you watch Elizabeth Taylor wafting around in ass's milk, you get a version of Cleopatra, I think that there is a very different story to be told about her in terms of how she actually dealt with the power struggles in a very male-dominated world at the time and won a lot of it.
Yeah. I think that's a great example. She was an amazingly successful politician, and yet everything that she's diminished in terms of it, she's just some hot bird who managed to get her own way because she put it out there. And all this slut-shaming nonsense about, so she had sex with some people. We're allowed to have sex, right? Men are allowed to have sex. Women are allowed to have sex. But yeah, the diminishment of her... She was a great politician, whether she was a man or a woman, right?
Exactly.
Effectively. And an even greater achievement because she did it, as you said, as a female in an all-male world. So,
absolutely.
So yeah,
super duper. And just one point. I did not have sex to get the Hercules or the helicopter.
Noted.
I just wanted to note that for the record. Before I tried to make an alignment of my story with Cleopatra. No, not the case. Anyway, moving swiftly on.
I'm that sort of thing where the guys would always ask you to go and get things done because they'd go, Bridge, you can go and flutter your eyelashes.
Yeah.
And again, I also felt, though, that it was a diminishment of my advocacy skills because actually, when I used to go in and get stuff done, particularly with one boss who would say no immediately to stuff, so I had gone and he'd written a vision and a whole mission statement for the year about what we were going to achieve. And I just went in and pointed out that the things that we wanted to do were completely in alignment with what he had said. And yet, of course, when I go out and have achieved whatever it is that the boys had not been allowed to do, and I was allowed to do it, or we were all allowed to do it now because I persuaded the boss. And again, it would just be put down to, Bridge, you fluttered your eyelashes. No acknowledgement of the fact that I actually did a bit of homework and did a little bit of, psychology. So,
but no, it's just the fact of that, there are a whole host of skills, Cleopatra of which had some, but it was not her whole makeup. I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, off my hobby horse on that one. Who's your next one?
Okay, my next one is Bell Hooks. She's a writer and an influencer in the sort of nicest sense of the word, in the fact not sort of Instagram-y, but she's an educator maybe. And so I'm kind of thinking now that there's a bit of a theme going on here because she also started off as a lecturer, a teacher, but she's best known for writings on race, feminism and class. But particularly, and while she talked about oppression and particularly racial oppression in the US, and she's a big feminist, but one of the things that I love about her work and the influence that she has had is that she equated love as a really, really important element. And so particularly in terms of feminism, in terms of her influence, in terms of recognizing that men needed compassion. And we did a whole session with Daniela Fiandaca about this compassion for men, but Bell Hooks was one of the first women to talk about this idea that men need help to deal with their emotions, that emotions are important and that they're important in leadership, and that leadership isn't just about these sort of patriarchal ideas of strength, courage and assertiveness, but vulnerability and all of those things. And so she was talking about these things before really it became a mainstream kind of discussion. And I'm sure that St. Brené has been very, very influenced by Bell Hooks. She started in the 1970s and she's written like some of her notable works. So a lot of ones about love. She's done films, she's written poetry, she's written children's books. One that I'm currently looking at the moment, which is again about this idea of men needing compassion. I'm just trying to find it. The will to change, men, masculinity and love. She's written a lot about masculinity, particularly black men and masculinity. And so, yeah, what I find about her is that she's got such a wide range, because she also talks about class. She then really started to look at intersectionality again, before intersectionality became such a buzzword, because she experienced segregation. So she talks about civil justice, about racism, about class, about feminism.
The state, do we know?
So she was brought
it's
up
good to
in,
sort of like know the background.
yeah, so she was brought up in Kentucky, so it was a segregated town. Her father was a janitor, her mum was a maid in the home of white families. So she experienced that, not only the sort of social classism of being working class, but also being black working class in a segregated experience. And despite that, she went on to be a teacher and a lecturer and a professor. So she was teaching English and ethnic studies at the University of Southern California, but has gone on to teach at Ivy League universities, and she's published, she's written for all kinds of journals, the New York Times, but focused a lot on how education plays into maintaining some of the patriarchal capitalism, racist elements, and particularly about marginalisation of black women. And she was one of the first people also who raised the issue about feminism at the time being mainly white women and focused on white women's issues, rather than recognising that black women were far more marginalised generally than white women, and that white female feminism wasn't really doing anything for black females.
So from a leadership perspective, she is giving voice and words to particular minority elements or minority themes, equally bringing forward what we've talked about before as love being an integral part of leadership.
Yeah, and particularly about the influence of teachers. So she really, really strongly advocated for the fact that teachers had this capacity to make huge changes in people's lives, because they were often the first influencers. And so she was a thought leader along a lot of lines, and started off a lot of debate about things that are now accepted as pretty much standard and normal. But at the time, she was...
Back in the 70s, not so much,
Yeah, she was a radical as well. She's been included as Time magazine's 100 Women of the Year in 2020. She's called the rare rock star of a public intellectual who reaches wide by being accessible. And so I think that sort of giant brain, but with this amazing heart and humility and vulnerability to talk about love as the real center of leadership, I think I love that idea, and it's something that I also feel strongly about.
I think the other thing is you know, when I talk about my somatic work, and our shaping all comes from particular places, and one of the things that in terms of those arcs of where our shaping comes from, and it starts with family, but then it goes into institutions, one of which of course is so integral, is school. So, you know, for you to have chosen the person that bought the education environment that you had for yourself in Cornelia, and then what the shaping must be like for those who were shaped by the teachings of bell hooks, you know, there's definitely some connections with that, and why, again, if we go back to our theme, to make sure that we keep coming back to it, they are the catalyst for lasting change. Because, you know, there it is in the books, and for us to learn, but that learning, again, you know, it's like you say, it goes to the mainstream, and yet the learning has been there for quite a while. Now, what's interesting is that the next person I'm choosing, I spoke to a friend of mine, and I said, right, I've got this toss up between these two, and there's one that I know more about and one that I don't, but I really feel that I want something different to bring to the party, and a bit like, you know, not necessarily bringing stereotypical for me, you know, I'm going to choose all women who are white. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to sort of like mix it up because I wanted to put myself into a different situation as well about what are other leaders like that I may well have not come across so much. So this next lady, I think where my friend and I got to when we were talking about it is that what's needed is to know and understand the story of this lady and not just have her being something that we see in artwork or on a t-shirt or on a mug. And that is Frida Kahlo. And she's, so 1907 to 1954, you know, God, we really should have had her around for longer. But the more I read about her life, I'm like, bloody hell, you know. So this is my piece about she is a catalyst for lasting change. Yes, it comes because of the imagery that she actually created. And yet, again, there was so much more to her than just the fanship of the art piece. So she had polio when she was 6, which is where the first piece of the disability puzzle came from, which left her with a permanent limp on her right-hand side. And in fact, even though where she was in Mexico and that, you know, it was unheard of for girls to be doing many sports activities like soccer and stuff like that anyway, and with her disability, her father pushed her to actually get involved in things that were much wider than the view or the field that girls of her age would have been in. So that was the first one. She then at 18 was in a massive car crash. So that's when she was bedridden and started painting from her bed. And throughout her life, she had this incredibly torrid relationship and marriage with Diego Rivera, which was just utterly full of infidelity. And he almost encouraged her to go off and have affairs so that he could have them, because he was having them all the way through. So there's quite a lot in her story which is about love and what that really looked like and quite how tortuous it was. And so with these elements, there is the artwork that she then conveys is, yes, it's this set of self-reflections, gave voice to her life, which was around her desire for children, but she had masses of miscarriages, her injuries, the surgeries that she had to go through, depression, the affairs. Diego had a mammoth affair with her sister, for example. So a lot of the things that happened in her life were part and parcel of her self-reflections. And yet you then look at her artwork and all of the other elements that are actually in there, a lot of Mexican motifs, her mantra of Viva la Vida, you know, lust for life. So there was this real love as well of her Mexican heritage, where she'd come from. Oh my God, there is just so much here now. But it's not just about self-reflection. There was so much about that when you actually put all of those topics into artwork or wherever it might be, other people can go, oh God, well, that's where I am as well. That's happened to me. So she actually used all of these levels of adversity and she turned trauma into art. She took her Indigenous American heritage, put it into art. So she did become, in a similar way that you're saying about Bell Hooks, she became this pioneer, you know, of one, self-representation, two, finding a way of having her voice, and cultural pride. And so I think, you know, from her background and all the rest of it, I just thought, God, you are flipping awesome. And I can sense that within the artwork, she has found a place to support others who are marginalised, find their voice through creativity. So I think it was a really different idea for me about what leadership can actually look like. And whilst I haven't got quotes for everybody, I did pick up this quote from her where she said, they thought I was a surrealist, but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality. And so I think that for all sorts of reasons, on all sorts of topic levels, and showing her environment, her culture, and the things that happened to her, she has given that sort of permission to everybody else to actually paint, speak, whatever it might be. about the things that are at the core of you. I was so pleased that I just decided to go somewhere completely different with my ideas on that one, because it really left me quite reflective.
Yeah, that's lovely, and I'm really glad there's an artist in there as well, female artist, because again, it's really interesting. I went to a sort of immersive theatre production, I'm going to kind of call it that, I'm not entirely sure that it was, but which was held in the Crawford Art Gallery in Cork by a woman who is actor and comedian and social commentator, but had studied at art school there. And you start off, there's a big group of us, and we're in this where the lectures used to happen, because the art gallery used to be an art college. And she goes, so when I first came to study art at the college, there was not one single mention of a female artist. Like, everyone that we would talk about, it was all male artists. And so again, demonstrates not only the challenges as a woman of colour, but as a woman to be taken seriously in the art world, where it still is, the majority of lauded artists are male. And so the fact that she has become so iconic and her images are so really visceral to so many people, in a way it is incredible, because the fact that she was able to rise up and still be memorable in a place where female artists are not so well known or recognised is amazing. And I love the interpretation. I haven't really looked at her very much. I'm sure my sister, who's far more into art than I am, will be there going tutting at the fact that I that I haven't done an in-depth thought analysis of Frida Kahlo, but anyway, thank you for that. It was really nice. I enjoyed that.
I think the other thing as well is that, we've done an episode before about where's your edge, your learning edge.
Yes.
And so whilst my third one, when we get to them, is perhaps more within my comfort zone, and more I can see, I can see us as leaders, and I can see other leaders in that. I thought, actually, I want to just go and test where my stretch actually is, to see other things. There is within me, I look as I do, I am as I am. I'm here not a person of colour, I'm not disabled, I have had children, but just to find a way of actually being able to step into somebody else's shoes when you haven't got that person in front of you to converse with, to hang out with the art. Because all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, there's such a different way of actually being at an edge, which I thought was quite, I enjoyed. Whilst it made me also feel quite uncomfortable, but that's the good thing about it.
Cool.
Number 3.
Okay, my number 3 is the notorious RBG, so Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And
we could have definitely... She was on my list. I'm very glad I went a very different way then, otherwise we would have been at 5.
Okay, well,
Good.
that's not bad. That is
One
not
out of 3.
bad. But and to be honest, one of us had to choose her.
Absolutely rude.
An extraordinary woman, and in case there is anybody who doesn't know who she is, she was an extraordinary Supreme Court judge who she's got so many firsts in her sort of resume. Her husband was diagnosed with testicular cancer in her first year of law school, and so she looked after her sick husband while helping him keep up to date with his studies, and she maintained her position at top of the class. So she went to Harvard, and she was one of 9 females in a 500-person class, and she was a mother. And she was chastised for taking a man's spot. I know how she feels. I've been told that on a number of occasions. She was the first female member of the Harvard Law Review, and despite she was had the best academic record, she was still discriminated against. She found it difficult to get a job, and then when she did find jobs, she always had a lower salary than her male counterparts. So anyway, extraordinary career. She has taken part in 6 landmark cases before the US Supreme Court, particularly with regard to gender discrimination. But in terms of that, she wasn't just looking at women who were left behind, but also men. I think that one of the important things was that she believed in the fight for justice, but she brought, as a leader, brought this amazing humanity into her work, because, you know, she had experience looking after someone, a loved one who was sick, as a carer, as a mother. She had experienced a lot of the things that she felt passionate about fighting, but she never felt she could overstep the mark. She always believed that it was for the lawmakers to change the law. And I think that one of the things, certainly things I read about her, one of the things that she was most proud of was that she worked with President Obama to pass legislation on a case that she had actually lost, which was about fair pay. And the act was named after the plaintiff in the case that was lost, who was a woman who wasn't being paid the same as her counterparts. The act was then called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. Whether that lasts in the current climate, who knows. She was a really dedicated hard worker. She never missed a day of work. Even she was going through chemo, through surgery when her husband passed away, until maybe 2 years before she ultimately passed away. She was still working her arse off, I guess it's fair to say, to ensure that there was justice for those people who needed it. And I think some of the things that explain her view of leadership was fighting for the things that she cared about, but doing it in a way to get other people to join her. And that, I think maybe that was one of the greatest things that she did, was that, you know, she wasn't all there sort of pioneering by herself, going, look at me, this is the way to go. She inspired other people to come on board with her. And the other thing that I think is really interesting was that she often disagreed very, very strongly with other members of the Supreme Court, because, as we know, the Supreme Court justices in America often are appointed in terms of their political ideologies. And so there often would be Supreme Court judges who came from opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of ideology, and yet she managed to still maintain cordiality and friendship even with some of the justices, because she said you can disagree without being disagreeable, and she was hugely respected for that, I think. Yeah, and so she has this extraordinary legacy. She is an icon in her own right now, and I think that she will be an inspiration for men and women for decades and decades to come.
I agree. I did do some work, because I love the film On the Basis of Sex that was telling her, which I thought was really, really good. But there's books I came across as well that we can put in the references. One about My Own Words, which is a collection of her speeches. Another one by Irene Carmen and Shana Niznik, if I've said that right. The Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So some good stuff to read more about her, because I thought she was amazing. So yes, you pinched her, so it's a good job I decided to do something different. But I do wonder with my third one whether there is an element of whether this lady sometimes perhaps looked across at the amazing Ruth and went, aha, because my third one is Jacinda Ardern.
Oh, yeah.
Prime Minister of New Zealand, or was until 2023. And as I say, I just felt when I started looking at the leadership skills that come to the fore, but again, I went back digging in and sort of like wanted to go, oh, I wonder where she was born, and I wonder what her life was like and what have you. And what became very clear with some of the stuff that I actually read about and went and looked at was that she was in student leadership roles very early on. So from a very, very young girl, she was the one that would sit on the student council. In fact, we're not even talking about being at uni yet, but would arrive aged 10 to 12 with notes for the meeting.
Yeah.
You know, so was seen as a bit weird, bit of a nerd, but was the girl who went and did the research on what an untucked shirt would look like. A proper tailored untucked shirt would look like. She also then campaigned to allow the girls to wear shorts rather than just skirts. She wore a skirt throughout her schooling, but wanted there to be the opportunity that if a girl wanted to wear shorts, she could wear shorts. You know, there's lots of quotes from the teachers going, you just knew that when she came in, she was a child that was prepared. So campaigning about juicies, campaigning about shirts, campaigning about shorts, and then went into student leadership roles. But I think the other interesting thing was that when you look back, she wasn't head girl because she was the voice of the students. She was the voice of the people long before she ever became Prime Minister of New Zealand. It was always from that angle. And there were those that then wanted to sort of like argue the toss about where she'd come from, her upbringing, etc., etc. But the other part that I had, of course, had no idea about, I don't think it's something that she leads on, was that she worked part-time in a fish and chip shop, in the local fish and chip shop, which of course was the absolute sustenance from the area of New Zealand that she actually came from, so that she knew everybody in the community. She'd served the fish and chips. She'd been part and parcel of an integral part of that, rather than some, inordinately white collar sort of like element to her. And I loved hearing all of that, because then it sort of began to make sense of what we saw of her when she was in office, where, in a COVID perspective, she was thanking the team of 5 million for their efforts and sacrifices. That she, when it came to the Christchurch shootings, that she said, they are us. There was this messaging of inclusivity and condemning the person, but whilst being agnostic herself. But she doesn't seem to have led with self. She's led with this much wider capacity for a wider group. I don't know her, but from my understanding and my observations or assessments of what I've been reading, I love the fact that, and again, this will bring up all sorts of stuff, but, should there be a Prime Minister taking maternity leave whilst in office? Well, if you're a good leader, you can step away, because you should have the team around you that can do stuff, that legacy issue of the articulation and the direction that you've actually given, so it can go on whilst you step away to have a child. And then that integral part of bringing the child into it, because the child, I can't remember her name now, but went with her to the UN conference.
Yeah.
And then there's the campaigning around climate change and women's rights, etc., etc. And I think that the last one that I read, and I love, because this comes back to something we've talked about in other episodes, that she spends the time listening and learning from children. So it's like, when I look across the breadth of it, her leadership skill is to take it all in. Be it, the inordinate, impactful thing of society, or a particular group within a community, or for herself. I think the word I kept reading was relatable. And for me, she was utterly relatable, in a way that I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg was as well, in the things that she was bringing up. So yeah, she's my third one, and I was very happy that she again showed how in this day and age there are still traditional moulds to be broken.
Yeah, brilliant. Love that. And actually she was on my radar too, so that we had a little bit of overlap, but yeah, I went with RBG instead, and so I'm glad that she got entered into it.
She got in there. It never ceases to surprise me that somehow that we create these interweavings between the two of us, even though we spend this whole time about let's surprise each other, and then as we're about to start recording going, oh bloody hell, what were we thinking this could be? But every time it somehow seems to work itself out, and if we'd had the three the same, then that wouldn't have surprised me either.
And if we had the three the same, we would have just put our own spin on, or our
Absolutely.
own bits about why we'd chosen those people. So we still would have filled the time, and we've done the time perfectly.
Always.
Look at that. I don't know that it is always, Bobby, but
no, it's not. Usually you're having to cut hours out as we've whittled on about some spurious baloney. So let's not do that and end on a high. And I have loved the fact that we have come across 6 amazing women who have definitely been catalysts of lasting change.
Yay for women.
Yay!
Happy International Women's Day.
Indeed.
Right then.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening. All the resources mentioned in this episode can be found on our Spotify page, so you can read, listen, watch and explore in your own time whenever you want to dig a little deeper. Next week, we're shifting gears completely. We're diving into a longer conversation on sleep and self-care, and not just for leaders, but for all of us. Because whatever's happening in our lives, how do we ensure we don't leave ourselves out? How do we silence that little voice that tells us we're being selfish when we put ourselves first? And how do we navigate the tension between leaders eat last and the reality that we can't sustain others if we're running on empty? Well, I, for one, am looking forward to this one, but not before I've had a nap. Join us next time for Being Your Own Retreat.